In the bitter winter of 1847, an arrival in the secluded mountain settlement of Millbrook, Vermont marked the beginning of a tale that would shadow its survivors for the rest of their days. They came to call him Samuel Hawthorne, though no trace of that name can be found in any public register, before the dreadful February evening, when he staggered from a storm that had already taken 17 souls in Windham County. What the townsfolk would learn about this man, who spoke of distant realms beyond the ridges and practiced a strange medicinal art that spared dozens from a sweeping fever, would shatter their hopes in the goodness of mankind and uncover truths about endurance that polite society would refuse to confront. For 170 years, the Millbrook Historical Society has kept certain papers sealed from view, records that reveal not only the true identity of Samuel Hawthorne, but the monstrous steps he had taken to survive in those frozen heights, and far more chilling, what he continued after being welcomed into warmth again. His story is not merely one of endurance curdled into depravity. It is a record of how deeply a soul may sink once the thin shell of civility is stripped away, and how predators may disguise themselves as deliverers while quietly reshaping entire towns in their own warped creed. Before we continue the account of Samuel Hawthorne and the bleak winter that altered Millbrook forever, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell, because stories like this peel back the layers of America's forgotten past and expose its darkest buried truths. And share where you're listening from in the comments, because you may be unsettled to learn how many related vanishings plagued your state. During those merciless winters of the 1840s, the sequence of disappearances that followed Hawthorne's silent passage through New England touched more than 60 households across 4 states, and the authorities failed to link them until hope had already collapsed. The records you are about to hear arise from sources never copied, never shared publicly, and hidden for reasons that will soon become plain. They hold insights about humanity that few are prepared to face. Millbrook, Vermont in 1847 was the sort of hamlet where every neighbor believed they knew the business of the next, though in truth they understood far less than they imagined. Tucked in a hollow between the Green Mountains, roughly 40 miles northeast of Bennington, the town barely reached 300 residents, mostly farmers and lumbermen struggling to wrest survival from a stern wilderness. Chartered in 1789 by veterans seeking cheap land and renewal, the place had by the 1840s become one of those overlooked enclaves lying between larger settlements, joined to the outside only by perilous mountain tracks that vanished under snow for months. The winter of 1846-47 proved cruel beyond memory, with cold so vicious that the town physician, Dr. Ezekiel Putnam, formerly of Boston, now exiled by gambling debts to a quieter life, wrote in his journal of whiskey freezing solid in untouched bottles. The Connecticut River, normally the town's lifeline, lay locked beneath 4 feet of ice by mid-January. Even the most seasoned woodsman, like Henrik Bergstrom, a Norwegian accustomed to Arctic winds, confessed they had never endured a season so merciless. The spine of Millbrook was Main Street, mud in warmer months, a frozen corridor in winter, lined with Jeremiah Prescott's general store, a 2-story timber building that served as the community's trading post and gossip hub. Prescott, a sharp merchant who arrived from Connecticut in 1839, kept rigorous notes on every purchase and every whispered tale. His ledgers would later be vital in revealing the breadth of Hawthorne's hold upon the town. The Millbrook Inn, run by the widow Abigail Forrester at the eastern edge of Main Street, offered lodging to travelers trapped by storms. Since her husband's fatal logging accident 3 years earlier, she had sustained the business alone, and her establishment doubled as a social gathering place where townsfolk met on winter nights to drink corn whiskey, play cards, and trade scraps of distant news. At the center of town stood a modest white church where Reverend Isaiah Greenfield, a stern Yale-trained Congregationalist, preached to dwindling congregations. He had come in 1844 to raise a godly settlement in the wilderness. By the winter of 1847, his flock grappled with doubts far darker than simple hardship. Survival in such isolation tested the very fabric of belief. Most families lived in small frame homes warmed by whatever fuel they could gather before the snows shut the forests. More fortunate households, like the Thornberrys, proprietors of the valley's largest farm, had 2-story dwellings with cellars full of stored provisions and several hearths. Thomas and Grace Thornberry raised 3 children there. Sarah, 12, already taking on family responsibilities. Mary, 8, curious and bright. And young William, 5, cherished by his mother above all. By February, Millbrook faced trials that surpassed the ordinary cruelty of winter. 5 residents had already been lost. Old Bergstrom, once a storyteller beloved by the children, had frozen in his cabin when his chimney collapsed under the snow. Margaret Fairchild's infant succumbed to pneumonia despite Dr. Putnam's desperate care, leaving the young mother hollow and silent. Food and medicine dwindled alarmingly. The last wagons had arrived in November, and no one expected aid before thaw. Dr. Putnam's supplies were nearly gone, his final bottles of laudanum and quinine nearly spent, his surgical tools worn to the point that every procedure filled him with dread. Whispers spread of a cursed season smothering the town like a funeral veil. Some elders murmured about leaving the valley entirely once spring offered escape. Into this desperate, snowbound world, Samuel Hawthorne appeared, bearing knowledge and provisions that seemed like deliverance and proved to be anything but. February 18, 1847, etched in memory for all who outlived what followed. Recorded not only in Dr. Putnam's notes but in the journals of at least 6 residents who chronicled the strange and haunting events that began that night. Young Timothy Prescott, 14-year-old son of the merchant, first glimpsed the figure descending the mountain path in the teeth of a storm that had added 3 feet of snow since morning. He had been checking for frost damage at the store's back windows when he noticed what looked like a walking corpse against the swirling white. At first he dismissed it as a trick of vision caused by staring into the storm too long, but the shape clarified into the form of a man. He moved with eerie certainty, following the treacherous path from the high ridges with a steadiness that defied the blizzard's fury. Travelers caught by such storms rarely walked with intent. They usually wandered until they collapsed. But this stranger advanced as though guided by an unseen chart. Timothy called for his father, and soon half the able-bodied men in town stood outside Prescott's store watching. What they beheld seemed to break the laws of nature. The stranger walked upright against winds that bent trees almost flat. His steps were measured, unhurried, as though he strolled through gentle weather rather than a tempest that had already claimed lives. When at last he reached the edge of town, he appeared at death's threshold, yet impossibly alive. His garments puzzled the onlookers. The outer layer resembled a long coat cut from treated hide, yet the texture was unlike any leather known to the hunters or farmers. It looked thick, almost armored, and shed snow as if it were oiled or enchanted. Beneath it he wore multiple layers of tightly woven cloth that gleamed faintly like metal in certain angles of light. But most confounding were his boots. They left deep prints unlike ordinary footwear, marked by strange geometric impressions as though metal studs or spikes had been arranged in deliberate patterns across the soles. Dr. Putnam later sketched the tracks in his journal, noting their shape matched no footwear crafted in New England, nor any European design he recognized. The boots looked made for brutal terrain and bitter weather, hinting at a level of skill and knowledge far beyond what Hawthorne claimed of his humble mountain upbringing. Yet it was Hawthorne's physical condition that truly disturbed the townsfolk. Despite insisting he had wandered for many days through a deadly blizzard, he showed not a trace of frostbite. His fingers and toes were untouched, his movements fluid and his speech clear. Dr. Putnam examined him thoroughly and found his condition so extraordinary that he wrote pages, speculating Hawthorne must have found shelter and supplies far more recently than he admitted. The stranger stood tall, well over 6 feet, with a lean, hardened frame. Dark hair streaked prematurely with white framed a face that appeared no older than 35. There was the unmistakable strength of someone accustomed to labor and harsh living. Scarred hands, broad shoulders, legs built for punishment and distance. But what lingered in memory was his face. Sharp, angular features, high cheekbones, and a prominent nose that gave him a predatory air. His skin was weathered yet healthy, untouched by the pallor of starvation or long deprivation. And his eyes, icy pale blue, nearly colorless in certain light, seemed to look through people rather than at them. Children stared at him as they might a dangerous, captivating animal. Adults felt an instinctive need to keep their distance. Many later described the eerie feeling that he was studying them, memorizing their homes, family routines, and the social order of their small community. His speech only deepened the mystery. He spoke perfect English, but with an accent no one could place. Not quite British, not quite Germanic or Scandinavian, though echoes of each lingered in his cadence. Dr. Putnam, who had traveled widely, wrote that Hawthorne's accent seemed born of many places yet belonging to none. His vocabulary was educated and precise, yet he occasionally used strange, archaic words unfamiliar to everyone in Millbrook. When he finally told his story, it was mesmerizing and unsettling. He said he came from beyond the great mountains, from deep valleys where the sun behaved strangely and the seasons followed ancient laws. Pressed for details, he grew vague, speaking only of my people and the homeland across the white fields where the old ways rule the wise. He described a place where survival meant not conquering nature, but embracing its cruelty and rhythms. Children gathered eagerly to hear his tales. Adults, no matter how polite, felt a creeping instinct to avoid him, triggered by his watchful movements and the cold judgment in his eyes. Yet what he carried with him inspired the greatest unease. A leather satchel, made of the same strange weatherproof material as his clothing, never left his side. He called its contents his medicines and survival tools. Only later would Millbrook understand the nightmares that bag would bring. Still, in those first days, desperate as they were, starving and winter-struck, the townsfolk welcomed him like Providence. That first night in the inn, warming his hands around Mrs. Forrest's strongest coffee, he began to reveal his strange talent. When young Sarah Thornberry suffered a fit of coughing that Dr. Putnam feared was the onset of consumption, Hawthorne listened, studied her, and declared the illness to be a respiratory infection from poorly vented smoke. He drew from his mysterious satchel a vial of dark liquid smelling of pine and something sweet and unfamiliar. He instructed Sarah to take 3 drops in warm water before bed. Within an hour, her coughing eased. By morning, she breathed freely for the first time in weeks. Word spread like wind through dry timber, and by day's end, half the town lined up at the inn seeking relief from winter's torments. Within days, Hawthorne had become Millbrook's unofficial second physician. Dr. Putnam, initially suspicious of anyone who practiced medicine without formal education, found himself begrudgingly impressed. Hawthorne diagnosed illnesses with uncanny speed, located herbs hidden beneath feet of snow, and produced cures that seemed miraculous. When Sarah later developed signs of consumption, Hawthorne crafted a strange remedy by boiling roots with preserved mountain meat. Prepared in the old ways of my people, he said. The aroma drifting from his pot was unlike anything the town had smelled, sweet and rotten beneath, reminiscent, several remarked uneasily, of poor Henrik Bergstrom's body when it lay undiscovered after his chimney collapse. Mrs. Forrest, proud of her culinary skill, could not place the scent. When she asked, Hawthorne's smile held secrets. He spoke of ancient mountain survival traditions passed down through generations. The cure worked. Sarah recovered in 3 days, though she complained of terrible dreams, endless snows, hungry eyes staring from darkness, voices whispering promises of warmth and feasting if she joined them in the white waste. Her mother, Grace Thornberry, overwhelmed with gratitude, insisted Hawthorne stay in their spare room over the kitchen, despite her husband's unease. It was Grace who first observed his peculiar habits and recorded them in letters to her sister. Letters never sent but later found among family papers. Hawthorne slept no more than 2 or 3 hours at a time, always half alert, as if listening for something. He woke often to sit rigid at the window, staring into the blizzard-shrouded night with a fixed, haunting intensity. He vanished during the most lethal storms, claiming to gather ingredients. Yet he always returned unharmed, boots barely damp, carrying plants and materials impossible to find in the dead of winter in Vermont. And still, his satchel never left his side. Fresh meat proved the most perplexing among his acquisitions. While the town hunters hadn't seen wildlife in weeks and survived on dried and salted provisions from the autumn season, Hawthorne somehow returned time and again with what he insisted were rabbits, deer, and other woodland creatures caught during his forays. The cuts looked newly butchered and were expertly portioned, prepared in neat, precise pieces he claimed were part of ancestral techniques passed down among his people. Yet several veteran hunters noted something subtly off about the meat. The skeletal structure didn't match the animals he cited, and the flesh bore an unfamiliar firmness and hue unlike anything native to their region. Dr. Putnam, whose medical schooling included studies of anatomy, began to harbor growing suspicions about Hawthorne's supposed game. During an inspection of the pieces used in Hawthorne's remedies, Putnam spotted what strongly resembled human muscular tissue. When he cautiously voiced this to Hawthorne, the man chuckled darkly and explained that his people practiced methods of preparing meat that could transform even the harshest cuts into nourishing food. "You must understand, Doctor," Hawthorne murmured with that unnerving smile. "Survival in the true wilderness demands shedding the delicate fears of polite society. My people learned long ago that meat is meat. It sustains life regardless of its origin. What matters is the correct preparation and the reverence with which one accepts nature's gifts." Grace once found him at dawn polishing what appeared to be a lady's silver locket, rubbing it gently with a cloth while softly humming a tune she did not know yet found chillingly familiar. The song's cadence was mournful, strangely like the funeral hymns she recalled from childhood. When she questioned the trinket, Hawthorne smiled that same unsettling expression and said, "It belonged to a cherished companion who could not make the voyage, yet whose spirit remains at my side." But Grace was nearly certain she had seen that locket adorning Rebecca Henley, the wife of merchant James Henley, who had vanished with her husband on a trip to Albany the previous fall. The couple had been traveling through the mountains when an early snowstorm trapped them, and despite days of searching by authorities, no remains or belongings surfaced. The locket stood out, a silver piece decorated with delicate floral engravings brought from Ireland by Rebecca's grandmother. Grace had admired it on many of the Henleys' visits. Hawthorne's rented room soon became a source of mounting tension in the Thornbury home. Peculiar noises drifted through the walls each night, soft scraping like someone working with tiny implements, occasionally interrupted by muffled sobs or faint whimpers. The sounds were subtle enough to dismiss as shifting beams or winter wind, yet they repeated in deliberate rhythms too precise to be natural. When Grace's husband, Thomas, finally gathered the courage to inquire about the disturbances, Hawthorne claimed he was drafting maps to guide him home once spring thawed the roads and compiling journals to preserve the wisdom he had gained among them. He revealed to Thomas intricate diagrams inked on what seemed like treated hides, covered with symbols and markings unfamiliar to anyone in Millbrook. These maps were astonishingly detailed, charting elevations, climate patterns, and routes through land stretching far beyond the town's known geography. To those who studied them carefully, the maps revealed something far more sinister. They depicted every trail through the mountains, each hollow and shelter where someone might hide from a storm. More disturbingly, certain spots bore inscriptions in a language no one recognized, some marked with tally-like symbols. Other regions bore numbers suggesting Hawthorne was counting something or someone. Dr. Putnam, whose interest in Hawthorne's cures had grown into deep unease, began recording daily observations of his colleagues' behavior and the strange outcomes his treatments produced among townsfolk. These records would later become critical in uncovering the truth behind Millbrook's nightmare. The first alarming trend Putnam noted involved Hawthorne's patients. Though their immediate recoveries were remarkable, fevers lifted, vigor returned, and ailments vanished. Their personalities shifted subtly over time. Those treated began to crave meat with startling fervor, an odd fixation in the midst of a winter with scarce protein. They grew irritable and fiercely possessive of their provisions, showing territorial instincts that exceeded wartime frugality. Worse still were the mental disturbances. Many patients suffered identical dreams, wandering snow-choked woods where shadowed figures beckoned them with promises of nourishment in exchange for joining an eternal feast. The dream's eerie uniformity convinced Putnam that some agent in Hawthorne's concoctions might be influencing their minds. The breaking point arrived when Putnam decided to analyze one of Hawthorne's powders using techniques from his Boston training. Beneath his microscope, he discovered what unmistakably appeared to be human hair and minuscule bone fragments within a mixture Hawthorne had presented as crushed antlers blended with roots. When confronted, Hawthorne did not flinch nor deny. Instead, he seemed almost delighted by Putnam's deduction. "Ah, Doctor," Hawthorne said, pale eyes bright with strange admiration. "I hope someone here possessed the perception to grasp my purpose. Indeed, your findings are correct. The most potent medicines draw from the supreme source of life, human flesh." Putnam felt ice settle in his veins as Hawthorne calmly continued. "In my homeland, we learned ages ago that the human form contains all the healing essence required to restore and fortify others. Prepared with sacred rites passed down through true healers, human tissue becomes medicine of unparalleled power. It binds those who partake, forging a communion beyond your Christian rituals." The horror of Hawthorne's intent hit Putnam like a physical blow. Hawthorne was not merely feeding human remains to townspeople. He was indoctrinating them, dissolving their moral boundaries and conditioning them to accept cannibalism as righteous and restorative. The dreams, the cravings, the aggression, each a step in a calculated descent toward humanity's darkest hunger. As winter waned and March approached, Millbrook's atmosphere grew heavier, its secrets coiling tighter. Hawthorne's miraculous cures multiplied, yet so did troubling signs and whispered dread. Dr. Putnam continued his observations, compelled not just by curiosity but by the chilling certainty that the town was drifting into a horror disguised as salvation. Hawthorne's medical bag contained instruments unlike any Putnam had encountered, blades curved in unnatural shapes suited more to carving flesh than performing surgery, bone saws with teeth arranged for swift, brutal work, and vials of powders and liquids exuding scents alien to known remedies. Whenever Putnam asked for knowledge or samples, Hawthorne would deflect with tales of ancestral secrets, sacred knowledge preserved among chosen initiates that lost its potency if revealed to the unworthy. Understanding of Hawthorne's true nature crystallized the day young Timothy Prescott, the same boy who first spotted the stranger emerging from the storm, made a discovery that shattered any lingering doubts. While wandering the woods behind the Thornberry residence, Timothy stumbled upon what he assumed was an animal's burrow, or the collapsed entrance to an old mine shaft. The opening lay partly hidden beneath toppled logs and packed snow, nearly impossible to notice unless one stood at precisely the right angle. Yet, as Timothy brushed away debris to see how far the hollow reached, he realized someone had been using the cave-like space as an intentional storage area. The gap led into a natural pocket carved into the hillside, widened and altered to serve as a sophisticated supply cache. The walls were lined with stretched hides, treated in a manner unlike anything produced by local hunters. Inside this concealed chamber, wrapped in the same strange leather-like material as Hawthorne's garments, Timothy uncovered contents that froze his blood and sent tremors through his small hands as he opened bundle after bundle, revealing evidence darker than anything Millbrook had dared to imagine. There were garments, many of them, men's work shirts, women's dresses, children's winter coats, all neatly folded and preserved, yet marked by cuts and tears as though they had been sliced from their wearers rather than discarded. Several bore ominous dark discolorations that Timothy instinctively recognized as blood, despite his youth. The clothing spanned various styles and fabrics, hinting that the collection had come from numerous travelers over several years. More unsettling still were the personal possessions: wedding rings, pocket watches, delicate jewelry, children's playthings, family portraits, rosaries, prayer books, and dozens of sentimental objects no family would willingly abandon. Each item was meticulously cleaned and organized, like a grim catalog of trophies curated for a purpose only its collector understood. But what truly shattered Timothy's composure were the drawings he found bundled in oil-treated cloth. These sketches depicted human anatomy not for healing, but for systematic disassembly. Precise notes marked where to cut for maximum yield, how to preserve tissue during harsh winter months, and various preparation methods. Some illustrations showed techniques used on large game, deer, elk, bear, but others clearly detailed human forms treated with the same methodical approach, as though the body were merely another animal to be broken down. The clinical clarity and practicality of the diagrams suggested their creator had learned through extensive practice. Terrified, Timothy fled and told his father. At first, Jeremiah Prescott brushed it off as a child's winter-warped imagination, fueled by fireside tales. Yet Prescott trusted his son's instincts, and when the boy led him back to the cache, even he struggled to explain away the dreadful discovery. The most horrifying object was a journal written in the same meticulous script as Hawthorne's maps. Its entries spanned more than 3 years, recounting expeditions into the mountains and meetings with traveling families and isolated wanderers. The journal recorded these encounters with cold, methodical detail, describing the author's refinement of techniques for preserving resources and maintaining supplies in prolonged solitude. As Prescott read on, a chilling pattern emerged. The writer described studying and stalking travelers, especially small groups vulnerable to the mountain's brutality. He perfected ways to approach as a helper, lead victims to sheltered spots, and eliminate them unseen. One entry, 18 months before Hawthorne arrived in Millbrook, told of a family of 5 headed to Albany. The author offered guidance through a shortcut, then trapped them during a storm. The subsequent description read like a detached medical procedure, recounting how each family member was killed and their bodies processed. This was not random violence or opportunistic theft. It was a structured system designed to procure human flesh for nourishment and for use in Hawthorne's medicinal preparations. The journal praised human meat as the most complete source of sustenance and included methods for storing it long-term. Most disturbing were notes on the psychological effects of introducing human flesh to unsuspecting individuals, beginning with minute amounts hidden in food or medicine, gradually increasing the quantity until the person consumed it knowingly and without revulsion. The writer described how this conditioning altered minds, making subjects more suggestible and compliant, and how it had been used in past towns to turn ordinary people into willing participants. As Jeremiah reached the newest entries, the horrifying realization struck him. What the journal described was happening in Millbrook at that very moment. Hawthorne was not simply providing illicit sustenance. He was transforming the townspeople into followers, shaping them into accomplices for his ongoing ritual of human hunting and consumption. Faced with this nightmare, Jeremiah Prescott confronted a terrible decision. The man hailed as Millbrook's savior, who had restored health during the worst winter in memory, was something far more sinister. How could a community accuse its miracle healer of murder and cannibalism when his remedies continued sustaining their lives? The evidence was undeniable, yet Prescott knew that merely presenting it might not sway a town so deeply indebted to Hawthorne. He feared the people would reject the truth or believe the proof fabricated, especially if Hawthorne provided persuasive explanations. Prescott turned first to Dr. Putnam, hoping the physician could help reveal the truth without igniting chaos or giving Hawthorne a chance to flee. Putnam's reaction was immediate and horrified. He had long harbored suspicions, and Prescott's findings confirmed his darkest fears regarding the nature of Hawthorne's medicine. Together they began quietly gathering information. Putnam pressed Hawthorne for details about his training, asking which institutions recognized his methods. Hawthorne responded with evasions and mystical references to distant mentors and ancient wisdom, requiring spiritual initiation. When Putnam suggested documenting the techniques for academic study, Hawthorne grew visibly tense, warning that sharing them would corrupt their power. Meanwhile, Prescott discreetly investigated disappearances across the region, speaking with traders and travelers. The pattern he uncovered extended far beyond Millbrook. Over the past 4 years, families journeying through the mountain passes had vanished at an alarming rate, their absence forming a disturbing chain leading straight to Hawthorne's arrival. Hunting expeditions that should have been simple had failed to return. Solitary travelers vanished into the woods, sometimes leaving behind abandoned wagons or camps that looked as though their occupants had fled in sudden panic. Each disappearance took place during winter, when brutal storms made searching futile and when bodies might not surface until spring if they ever appeared. All Prescott's most unsettling revelation came when he uncovered records of similar vanishings stretching back more than 7 years, forming a chilling route through parts of Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts. In each region, unexplained disappearances persisted for 2 or 3 years, followed by accounts of benevolent strangers arriving during dire circumstances, individuals with uncanny medical skill and wilderness knowledge that seemed too conveniently timed to be pure chance. In Grafton, Vermont, during 1844, a mysterious healer named Samuel Thorne surfaced during a diphtheria outbreak, saving countless lives before vanishing when spring arrived, along with several families who supposedly left in search of better prospects. In North Conway, New Hampshire, in the brutal winter of 1845, a man going by Samuel Blackthorne aided the town during food shortages, only to disappear once curious minds began questioning his history and methods. The pattern repeated itself like a grim refrain. Arrival in a crisis, building trust through seemingly miraculous treatment, gradual introduction of strange remedies and customs, and eventually either the town's full descent into his corrupt philosophy, or the quiet removal of those who knew too much, followed by a move to another unsuspecting community. Dr. Putnam made his own horrifying breakthrough when he subjected Hawthorne's preserved remedies to more rigorous chemical testing. Drawing on his formal training, he confirmed what he had long feared. The medicines contained human tissue, multiple sources, in fact, indicating that Hawthorne had access to an ongoing supply of bodies that he processed for various uses. Even worse, Putnam discovered substances that affected the brain, making patients crave continued doses while becoming increasingly vulnerable to suggestion. The miraculous cures weren't just effective treatments, they were tools of psychological conditioning, binding patients to Hawthorne while slowly eroding their moral resistance to increasingly disturbing behavior. When Putnam finally confronted Hawthorne, the stranger reacted in a chillingly calm manner. Instead of denying anything, he seemed almost relieved to be understood. "You fail to grasp what true survival demands," Hawthorne murmured, his pale eyes shining with a predatory intensity that turned Putnam's stomach. "In the places I have traveled, necessity strips away the illusions your society clings to. The body provides all it requires if one has the knowledge and the resolve." He spoke like a teacher addressing students, explaining that civilized notions of taboo were luxuries afforded only to the comfortable. When starvation loomed and death hovered over every home, he argued, such restrictions became dangerous weaknesses. The human form, he insisted, was simply another resource, and refusing to use it was foolishness that invited extinction. After that exchange, Putnam had no doubt. Hawthorne was not merely a murderer. He was a predator who had refined his methods over years, using medical expertise to disguise and perfect his atrocities, while subtly reshaping societies in his wake. Soon after, Millbrook's decline accelerated. More residents began displaying the unsettling tendencies Putnam had observed. Ravenous hunger, especially for meat, individuals waking at night to devour whatever protein they could find, sometimes uncooked, children inventing disturbingly violent games centered on butchering and preparing food, adults quietly gathering keepsakes from the deceased, claiming sentiment while behaving with unsettling possessiveness. Outsiders once welcomed were now watched with cold appraisal. When a lost traveler arrived during a March blizzard, several townspeople observed him the way hungry animals study prey, their expressions hollow and calculating. The crisis reached a breaking point when Mary Thornberry, the youngest daughter of Grace Thornberry, began displaying symptoms that showed how deeply Hawthorne's influence had spread. The 8-year-old developed a fierce longing for raw meat and suffered terrifying dreams of gaunt figures in the snow, urging her to join their feast and embrace their ancient ways. Grace discovered her child in the cellar at midnight, devouring a slab of salted pork with feral hunger, her face and hands smeared with grease. When Grace tried to intervene, Mary growled and bared her teeth like a cornered animal. Her small eyes gleamed with the same eerie light seen in Hawthorne's gaze, and her voice carried his unsettling cadence as she spoke. "The teacher says we must eat what the mountain gives. He says the old ways were wasteful. When we learn to eat properly, we'll never fear hunger or winter again." Grace realized in horror that her daughter, and by extension many others, was being conditioned to embrace cannibalism as not only acceptable, but righteous. That same night, Thomas Thornberry found Hawthorne in their barn, working by candlelight over a large slab of meat on the livestock table. At first, Thomas assumed it was an animal, but as he looked closer, dread settled like ice in his stomach. The pale flesh, the delicate bone structure, it was human. Hawthorne handled it with practiced ease, arranging specialized tools that gleamed in the candlelight as he separated cuts and wrapped them in treated cloth. Nearby lay containers filled with organs and other remains, each marked with symbols identical to those in Hawthorne's journal. When he noticed Thomas, Hawthorne didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled serenely and beckoned him closer as though demonstrating a useful farm skill. "Ah, Thomas," he said in his steady voice, "excellent timing. I hope someone in your family would take an interest. Your children are adapting beautifully. It is only right you understand the work that supports their progress." Frozen in horror, Thomas could only stare as Hawthorne continued, his tone casual. "This came from the traveler last week. The poor soul was already dying when I found him. Waste is a sin, especially in times like these. Some of this tissue was included in Mary's treatment, hence her remarkable recovery." The meaning hit Thomas with crushing force. Hawthorne had been feeding his children human flesh disguised as medicine, using illness and trust to corrupt the family from the inside out. "You're nourishing my family with human beings," Thomas managed to say, his voice shaking and nearly lost in the stillness. "I am providing your family with the most potent nourishment, both physical and spiritual, that exists. Hawthorne corrected gently. Where I come from, we know that consuming human flesh creates bonds far deeper than ordinary kinship. Those who join in the sacred meal become part of an eternal fellowship, one that rises above the limits of life and death. Hawthorne set his instruments aside and faced Thomas fully, his pale eyes burning with zealous devotion. Your family is evolving, Thomas. Your children are being prepared for a future where hunger, cold, and solitude can never touch them again. They are being taught to see the world without illusions, where strength is measured by survival, where nothing useful is wasted, and where each passing grants life to another. Just when Millbrook believed its nightmare had reached its limit, the horror descended even further than anyone imagined possible. If this tale is chilling you to the bone, share it with someone who revels in dark mysteries. Tap the like button to support our work and subscribe so you never miss tales like this. Together we will uncover what fate awaits Millbrook next, because what Thomas witnessed that night in his barn was only the prologue to Samuel Hawthorne's final revelation. The confrontation deciding Millbrook's destiny struck on March 15, 1847, later remembered as the most violent night in the town's history. Dr. Putnam and Jeremiah Prescott had spent the previous day collecting proof and rallying confidants until finally convincing Reverend Greenfield and several other leaders that Hawthorne represented a lethal threat to them all. They acted only when desperation reached its breaking point. More residents displayed alarming behavioral shifts. Children vanished for hours and returned with blood on their garments and eerie, secretive looks. Families found human bones hidden in basements and barns. Their plan was to quietly detain Hawthorne and search his belongings, intending to present undeniable evidence to federal authorities. But Hawthorne had been observing Millbrook just as carefully as they had been studying him. When the group, Dr. Putnam, Jeremiah Prescott, Reverend Greenfield, Thomas Thornberry, innkeeper Joshua Foriski, and Constable Marcus Hartwell, approached the Thornberry home that evening, they stepped into a living nightmare. The house was unnervingly still, though candle flames glimmered through every window, casting shifting silhouettes that danced like living shadows. Far too still for a house that should have held a family and their peculiar guest. Only a low, rhythmic hum echoed in the silence, half chant, half song, pulsing with a cadence disturbingly like a heartbeat. Thomas Thornberry answered the door, but he was no longer the steadfast farmer they knew. His eyes were hollow and predatory, burning with the same vacant hunger seen in Hawthorne's most devoted converts, but magnified into something feral. He moved with animal grace, and when he smiled, his teeth looked subtly, impossibly sharper. Behind him, Grace Thornberry stood in eerie stillness, her hands smeared with what could only be blood, her dress torn and filthy with substances they dared not identify. Her hair hung loose, her expression beatifically serene, more horrifying than raving madness could ever be. Samuel has opened our eyes to true endurance, Thomas declared, his voice carrying Hawthorne's cadence rather than his own. He spoke as though reciting sacred doctrine about communion through winter hardship, and the holy duty that came with understanding real sustenance. Would you care to learn? Dr. Putnam forced his way inside, driven by instinct and training even as dread clawed at him. What he beheld would torment his dreams for decades. Furniture had been pushed aside to form a primitive altar in the center of the room. The dining table had become the ceremonial focus, chairs arranged in a perfect ring around it. Around the circle sat Grace, Sarah, Mary, young William, and several neighbors who had supposedly gone home hours before, each wearing the same empty, predatory stare. At the altar's center knelt Samuel Hawthorne, beside a table draped in a white cloth soaked in dark stains. Upon it lay remains Putnam first assumed belonged to livestock, but as his eyes adjusted, the truth struck him like a hammer. The butchered form was unmistakably human, dissected with cold surgical skill. Carefully separated cuts lay arranged with reverence. Nearby jars held organs and parts labeled with the same unsettling symbols found in Hawthorne's journal. This was no frenzied violence. It was ritual. It was ceremony. "Doctor?" Hawthorne said without glancing up, voice steady and almost gentle. "Excellent timing. We are completing young Mary's induction into the deeper truths of endurance. Theory alone cannot grant understanding. To truly grasp survival, one must partake in the sacred nourishment. He rose with slow, ritualistic grace, his tools glinting like relics from some ancient cult. The families lost in the mountains did not perish in vain, Doctor. They served a greater purpose. Their sacrifice ensured the survival of one who could make better use of their gifts than they ever might have. Dr. Putnam felt the weight of every stare in the room. The Thornberrys, the neighbors, each watched him with starving intensity, like wolves measuring prey. Whatever Hawthorne had fed them, whatever doctrines he had woven into their minds, had remade them into something beyond mere corruption. "You've been poisoning their minds and bodies," Putnam breathed, horrified. "Forcing them to embrace necessity," Hawthorne cut in, his voice swelling with missionary zeal. "To welcome a truth your fragile civilization refuses to face. Survival demands that the strong consume the weak. Waste is the true sin, and the human form provides perfect sustenance for human life." He gestured proudly to the arranged remnants. "Where I come from, where winter is harshest and life most fragile, we learned that true kinship requires sacrifice. The many sustain the few capable of leading them through the coldest nights. These people have shed weakness. They have united in purpose. They have become something greater, fit to endure whatever nature hurls against them." Reverend Greenfield finally found his voice. "You speak of cannibalism, murder, transforming these families into monsters like yourself, abandoning every virtue that separates humanity from beasts." Hawthorne laughed, soft, genuine, and more terrifying than a scream. Not madness, but confidence. "Pity. Monsters. Reverend, open your eyes. These souls are healthier than they have been all winter. Their children are thriving, learning skills that will sustain them forever. Their families are bound tighter than any promise of heaven could ever bind them. I've offered them something immeasurably more useful than your lofty ethical ideals. I've given them the mindset and abilities to endure anything this world may unleash." What followed was a sudden, savage clash unlike anything the men of Millbrook had ever imagined. Hawthorne's followers surged forward with terrifying unity, attacking with the seamless coordination of predators who had hunted together countless times. Their movements were smooth and rehearsed, making it clear this was far from their first defense of their newly formed order against outsiders. Thomas Thornberry moved with eerie speed, his once familiar hands now functioning like lethal tools that tore across Constable Hartwell's face before he could draw his weapon. Grace Thornberry, pulling a butcher's knife from her blood-smeared dress, advanced on Reverend Greenfield with chilling purpose, as though she had been thoroughly trained for such a moment. Most horrifying of all were the children. Sarah, Mary, and little William attacked in unison, their size allowing them to slip past defenses while their total lack of hesitation made them more dangerous than adults twice their size. They looked like children, but their predatory instincts marked them as something entirely different. Dr. Putnam fought desperately to survive against people he had treated and laughed with for years. He had delivered their babies, healed their wounds, yet now he faced only hollow shells who bore physical resemblance to neighbors and friends, but whose identities had been stripped away and rebuilt according to Hawthorne's warped ideology. The struggle inside the Thornberry home was frantic and brutal, fought with whatever tools were at hand, farm equipment, kitchen knives, and bare hands, in tight, chaotic quarters. The converted fought with fanatical resolve, defending not simply their lives but the very belief system that had remade them. The town leaders fought with equal desperation, knowing failure meant not only death but the perversion of every value they held dear. Dr. Barr Putnam escaped by a narrow margin, staggering from the house bloodied and shaken, forever haunted by what he had witnessed. Joshua Farisk managed to mount his horse and flee toward Bennington for outside assistance, but he never reached help. Reverend Greenfield, Constable Hartwell, and Thomas Thornberry vanished within that terrible place, swallowed by the horror that the Thornberry home had become. By sunrise, half of Millbrook prepared to act decisively, but they were no longer facing one dangerous man. They confronted an entire loyal following, trained and conditioned to defend their new beliefs, viewing anyone outside their group not as neighbors, but as enemies. The siege of the Thornberry property spanned 3 harrowing days and nights, devolving into a grim battle fought between people who once shared meals, prayers, and harvests. Led by Dr. Putnam and a few other untainted leaders, the unconverted fought not only to save their town, but to preserve the moral foundation upon which their lives had been built. Meanwhile, Hawthorne's followers defended themselves as a unified force, fortified behind barricades and hidden defenses clearly constructed over months of preparation. They possessed weapons, food, and medical resources, ensuring they could withstand a prolonged confrontation. Their movements were disciplined, their strategy sound. They fought like trained soldiers. The unconverted quickly realized they were at a terrible disadvantage. Hawthorne's followers moved through the home and outbuildings with practiced coordination, using the terrain to set traps and wield psychological pressure. But their most devastating weapon was the chilling reality of who they were. Former friends and family transformed into ruthless predators. Many attackers faltered, unable to strike at people they once loved. Even when those same individuals attempted to kill them, Dr. Putnam recorded the whole ordeal in detailed journal entries, documents, now regarded as one of the most extensive first-hand accounts of mass psychological indoctrination in American history. His words capture moments of heartbreaking tragedy. Fathers forced to battle their children, wives confronting husbands across makeshift defenses, families shattered by a force that dissolved the ties of love and loyalty. On the third morning, the conflict ended not in victory but in disappearance. When the exhausted townsfolk breached the barricades, they found the house abandoned, signs showing frantic flight. Hawthorne and his most devoted followers had vanished into the mountains, equipped with supplies and provisions enough to survive indefinitely. Millbrook never healed. Of the 43 people influenced by Hawthorne, only 12 ever returned. They came back pale, haunted, and silent, refusing to speak of their time in the wilderness. Most left town quickly, unable to live among the memories or the mistrust of neighbors who could not be certain the conditioning had faded. Some fled to distant cities. Others disappeared entirely, heading west into places where their altered minds and disturbing skills might draw less notice. Dr. Putnam devoted the rest of his life to documenting Hawthorne's methods and the systematic transformation of ordinary villagers into something unrecognizable. His journals, sealed in restricted archives of the Vermont Historical Society, remain the most complete record of what experts now call the earliest documented case of widespread psychological conditioning, meant to dismantle core moral boundaries. Physical evidence only confirmed his account. When snow melted, search teams uncovered caches hidden deep in the wilderness containing preserved remains and belongings of missing travelers and families. It became clear Hawthorne had operated across New England for years, refining his techniques on isolated victims. These caches hinted at a vast and organized system of butchery and preservation, along with supplies for producing the substances Hawthorne used to manipulate minds. The scale and professionalism of the operations implied he had allies, or belonged to a larger network. The most chilling discovery emerged in late April: a hidden mountain settlement stocked with advanced preservation tools, unusual medical instruments, workshops, and detailed journals chronicling his research into what he termed survival psychology. These writings revealed Millbrook was not a random spree or descent into madness. It had been a controlled, deliberate test of a new form of society, one rooted in what Hawthorne called post-civilizational survival doctrine, designed to forge self-sustaining human communities free from conventional morality. His ultimate objective appeared to be the creation of methods for sustaining human societies during prolonged eras of collapse by discarding ordinary ethical restrictions and embracing pure survival efficiency. The journals described parallel trials carried out in other remote New England settlements over almost 15 years, each following the same disturbing sequence: quiet entry during hardship, trust earned through real medical skill, gradual introduction of abnormal survival principles, methodical psychological reshaping to break moral resistance, and finally either total conversion of the town or destruction of all witnesses before moving on. Most unsettling were the sections outlining Hawthorne's far-reaching intentions for expanding his mission. He had marked numerous vulnerable mountain settlements and formulated step-by-step plans for infiltrating and reshaping each one. His long-term ambition was to forge a network of interdependent cannibalistic enclaves able to support one another through brutal winters and catastrophic social breakdowns, spreading his doctrine across the isolated wilderness of New England and eventually far beyond. The writings made clear that Hawthorne was not the mastermind behind the system, but rather a field agent serving a shadowy organization dedicated to designing and testing survival protocols for an expected societal collapse. Repeated references to the council and the directors indicated guidance and oversight by figures with immense resources and long-range strategic thinking. Samuel Hawthorne himself was never apprehended despite exhaustive efforts by local law enforcement, federal officers, and military personnel tasked unofficially with resolving what became known privately as the Millbrook Affair. He vanished without trace after leaving the town, prompting fierce speculation. Some believed he perished in the wilderness without the support network he had constructed. Others suspected he continued his grisly mission somewhere new, blending into communities unprepared for his tactics. The truth may indeed be darker. In 1851, just 4 years after Millbrook, isolated Maine settlements reported a pale-eyed stranger arriving in harsh winter, offering medical treatment and survival knowledge to desperate families. In 1854, remote New Hampshire villages described a similarly unsettling figure with advanced medical skill and uncanny insight into human vulnerability. Each case mirrored Millbrook's tragic pattern: arrival during crisis, trust built through genuine care, slow introduction of strange practices, then either community transformation or unexplained disappearances before the stranger moved on. The final recorded sighting of someone matching Hawthorne's description came in 1859 at a northern Michigan mining camp suffering under lethal winter conditions. Witnesses described a pale-eyed man with prematurely white hair who claimed origins in distant lands, beyond the great forests where ancient survival traditions endure. For 3 months he nursed the miners through starvation and sub-zero temperatures, with medicine that worked astonishingly well and rationing, advice that saved lives. When company wagons arrived with supplies in spring, he had vanished, taking 12 miners who were never located. Records later uncovered revealed unsettling behavioral shifts among those left behind: compulsive food hoarding, fixation on consuming raw meat, and a rigid social order that did not match typical camp hierarchy. Dr. Putnam's last journal entry, written shortly before his death in 1863 from pneumonia, carried a chilling warning that continues to trouble historians and investigators. He claimed that the man called Samuel Hawthorne understood a truth civilized society refuses to acknowledge. Given the right conditions, proper manipulation, and enough time, anyone can be persuaded that unthinkable acts are not only acceptable but essential to survival. Hawthorne did not create monsters. He unveiled the ones buried within ordinary people, waiting only for justification to surface. Putnam's caution proved grimly accurate. The American Civil War erupted 14 years after Millbrook, producing countless examples of everyday individuals committing horrific acts they would once have deemed unimaginable. Industrial tragedies and social upheavals of the late 19th century further demonstrated how swiftly communities could collapse into brutality when survival overshadowed morality. Modern psychological studies later confirmed much of Putnam's account. Research into cult recruitment, military conditioning, and survival psychology identified the same core methods Hawthorne used so effectively: slow escalation of extreme ideas, fostering dependence, severing outside influences, and dismantling moral norms through incremental, seemingly rational steps. This unsettling account reveals that humanity's greatest terrors often arise not from supernatural forces or impulsive violence, but from deliberate manipulation, executed by those who understand how to exploit primal instincts and essential needs. The tale of Samuel Hawthorne exposes the fragility of civilization and the terrifying ease with which the boundary between healer and destroyer, mentor and corrupter, can vanish when survival becomes the only meaningful value. What are your thoughts on this chilling narrative? Do you believe all truths have been uncovered? Or might there be deeper secrets behind Hawthorne's identity and the organization he served? Share your theories about what truly motivated him, and whether his hidden network might still operate in forgotten corners of the country. If you found this eerie journey into America's obscured past compelling and crave more tales that challenge what we think we know about our history and one another, subscribe, enable alerts, and share with fellow enthusiasts of sinister historical mysteries. Join us next time as we unearth another buried chapter from the dark margins of American history, one authorities hoped would remain forever forgotten.